Hi, I'm Brett, papercartridges.com, here at the shop again. On the desk today is the Danish Model 1848 tap rifle, and I mentioned this in an earlier video I did on the Austrian Kammerbuchse, the Model 1849. And some of you asked me to do a video on this particular rifle, so here we go. But before I blabber on and on about it, first let's head to the range, we'll shoot it, and then, because this is Paper Cartridges channel, we will come back and talk more about the history and context of this very rare and interesting rifle.
The Model 1848 tap rifle is about a 16.9 millimeter or 67 caliber rifle, and it used a conventional paper cartridge. The 620 grain bullet is about 1.5 ounces or 41 grams, and it gets loaded into the muzzle while still wrapped in grease-coated paper. The bullets are deliberately sized small enough that they will usually fall all the way down to the pillar, and then the bullet gets expanded by 1 or 2 sharp blows with the heavy ramrod. This isn't kind to the muzzle crown, and you'll notice I try to ram it down as straight as possible. The powder charge is 1 kvint of powder in the Old Danish, which works out to about 3.9 grams or a little more than 60 grains. I haven't shot the tap rifle in several years, and this was the first time ever from the bench. Right away I noticed that it was shooting extremely high at the 100-yard target. And this is perplexing because I was using the lowest setting on the sights. The low settings on these sights was marked with what I thought was a 200, which stands for 200 Danish alen. It's about 137 yards or 125 meters. And it turns out it wasn't 200 alen at all, and I'll explain all that in a few minutes. Hi. By aiming insanely low, like in the grass, I brought the impact down and I could see it, and that gave me an idea of how low I had to aim. And that's how I figured out how to put the rounds onto the paper target. I have to aim something like 3 or 4 feet low. So I'm aiming below the target frame, and that doesn't give me a real aiming point. But what I thought were ridiculous results were actually exactly how this rifle was supposed to shoot. The rifle was doing everything correctly. And my friend Thomas has been an enormous help on this project, especially with providing conversions of the Danish measurements and copies of original Danish military manuals. And he showed me that in the original manuals, these rifles were sighted at an initial range of 300 alen, and to hit a target within 300 alen, soldiers were instructed to aim at the knees, so aim several feet low. And I didn't realize it at the time, but experimental archaeology with the historic bullet and the original powder load was a perfect match to the ballistics mentioned in the historic manuals. So the rifle is shooting exactly how it was supposed to. And this really isn't much of a group, but keep in mind I am aiming at a point in the grass about 3 feet below the target. I don't really have a good point to aim at. This isn't really impressive shooting by modern standards, but for a rifle that is 173 years old, I'm just happy to be on paper, and I'm sure this rifle shot a lot better when it was new. Another thing I noticed is that the recoil is surprisingly strong compared to shooting an expanding bullet like a Minie. This is because the bullet gets expanded by the soldier's ramrod and it doesn't absorb any energy from the powder to expand it. All that power goes to propelling it out of the barrel, and 60 grains really goes a long way. And not to make any excuses for my bad shooting, but the nipple on this rifle was probably made the same year Doc Holliday was born, and it leaks a lot of gas, and this will definitely contribute to inconsistent shooting, especially causing vertical stringing.
Now that we're back from the range, I do got to make a quick admin note. This is the weekend of the 30th anniversary of the release of the Gettysburg motion picture. So the town is crawling with tourists. This is being videoed in mid-October. So if you hear noise outside, I can't control it. The town is overrun today. But this Model 1848 tap rifle, very obscure and pretty rare here in the United States. In fact, this one right here is the only one that I personally know of to be in the United States. If you have one, if you know someone who has one, let me know. It would be cool to, to get to know another tap rifle owner. But as you saw, it shot extremely high at 100 yards. The bullets were going way over the top of the target. And it took a while to figure out where this thing was shooting. And the sights are zeroed in the old Danish Alen measurement. So the sights are actually zeroed for 300 Alen, which works out to about 210 yards. And it took me a little while because it does say 300 on the back of the sights here, but it's 170 something years old, and it is hard to discern that. I thought it said 200, and so 200 Alen is only 150 something yards. So I was confused. It took a while for me to figure it out, and I had to bring my point of aim ridiculously low to get the shots finally coming out on paper. And you'll notice in the video too, this was before I finally broke down and invested in a sandbag to rest the rifle on. I don't like bench rest shooting. I like shooting standing offhand, but everyone wants me to shoot it from the bench, so I'm trying. My bench rest shooting technique is really bad. I'm getting better, and in other videos you'll see the sandbag rest that I bought, and my group's really tightened up since then. But anyway, once I did get this rifle on paper, it wasn't really grouping very well. It punched a lot of holes, but nothing really like a discernible group. But being a pillar breech rifle, the amount that the bullet gets expanded depends on how much force I am physically using to ram the rammer down on top of the bullet. And that definitely will have an effect on the accuracy of the bullet because it is more or less expanded because of me and not by any function of the rifle. So you might wonder, what is a pillar breeched rifle, and why did this go from being one of the most advanced pieces of military hardware to being obsolete in just about a year? And the 19th century saw an extraordinary leap in firearms technology, basically from the antiquated to the modern. So at the start of the 19th century, you have flintlock smoothbore muskets. And at the end of the 19th century, you have 6.5 Mauser, center fire rimless cartridges that look like the ammo you go down and buy at the store today for brand new designs. So that the change was happening so fast. Weapons would be cutting edge and they would be hopelessly obsolete in the span of a decade or even less. And the quick speed of weapons development overtook this rifle, the 1848 tap rifle. When it was designed and introduced for the Danish army in 1848, it was one of the best rifles in the world. And in fact, I would consider this to be like the pinnacle of advancement of the Touvinon system of a pillar breech rifle. And that's what this uses. Sometimes called carabine à tige. And tige is the French word for pillar or stem, and that's why it's sometimes called the pillar breech rifle. But it is a muzzle loader, so the bullet gets loaded being smaller than the barrel size, so it can go down easy. But in the breech here, sticking straight out of the base of the breech is a steel rod. That is the tige, the pillar. And the bullet gets loaded and it rests on top of that pillar. And I think I got a crude animation I might put in here to explain it. But the soldier has to expand the bullet by driving it down onto that pillar with a couple smacks from a very heavy ramrod. And the soft lead of the bullet will get squashed as it's being pressed down onto that pillar. It forces the lead out, and that's what fills the grooves of the rifling. So this predates the Minié system of a hollow-based bullet that expands when the gun fires. Being a Touvenon pillar breech system, it worked very well. It was one of the most successful pre-Minié rifle designs. And Touvenon carabine à tige rifles get adopted by most of the powers of Europe. There's a couple exceptions. The British don't. The United States also does not adopt a pillar breech rifle. That's why these things are really misunderstood on this side of the pond. But in 1848, this system was well advanced. It was highly developed, and the 1848 tap rifle is, like I said, like the pinnacle of the development of this type. And as a rifle type, it is a nice rifle. It's really well made. It is a quality, accurate rifle for its age. Interesting, rounded rifling, scalloped rifling, you could say, five groove rifling. The top of the pillar is rounded. It's a very late, final development stage of the pillar breech rifle. And I'll show you something that I don't think has ever been seen on the internet before, and that is a bullet that has been fired from an 1848 tap rifle. And you can see where the rifling has been forced into the little bumps on the edge where it took the rifling, and that big dent, big deep dent made in the base by ramming it down onto the pillar. And because this particular bullet was fired at a target only 100 yards away, it got badly deformed when it hit. But that's not the only deformation. Simply that ramming it down with that heavy ramrod, even though there's a recess in the head of the rammer that tries to preserve the pointed shape of the bullet, it still deforms the bullet. It's an unavoidable side effect, you could say, of a Touvenon pillar breech system. But it worked. In 1848, it worked really, really well, and no one had come up with anything better. More on the gun itself. The lock and most of the other pieces on the gun are marked with the serial number and the date of manufacture. So the three dates on here, the 1848 is model 1848. 1851 is the date, and 1856 is the serial number. So this is the 1856th model 1848 tap rifle, produced in 1851. And this is cool because it's also unit marked. It is marked to the Danish Army's 2nd Line Infantry Battalion, the 2nd Company, number 29. So it may even be possible somewhere in the Danish archives to identify who was actually issued this particular exact rifle. And that unit, the 2nd Line Infantry Battalion, was heavily engaged at Dibble during the Second Schleswig War. And that's how I think this rifle made its way ultimately to the United States. I think this one ended up being captured by the Prussians in 1864, brought home as a war trophy by the Prussians, and then brought home by some US GI either after 1918 or 1945 as a war trophy. The GI may or may not have known what it was. He might have thought it was some old German rifle. Ramrod is also unit marked. That's mismatched, though, to the 16th Line Infantry Battalion. If you're wondering what this little device is on the lock, and it's a form of safety. So when you are, let's say you're on guard duty, so you need to have a loaded rifle, and a loaded rifle is no good to you without a cap. But you don't want to lower the hammer down and let the hammer rest on a loaded and capped rifle, because if you were to accidentally hit the hammer inadvertently, uh, either catching it on a fence post or anything, and that kind of banged the hammer, that impulse can fire off the cap, and so the gun could go off. And to prevent that, you say, well, why don't you just put it on half cock? Well, that puts tension on the spring. And so if you're marching around, first of all, the cap can fall off. You don't want that to happen. This is now the cap is exposed to moisture if you're on guard duty. And you've got tension on the spring, and springs cost money. So a clever way to keep the gun loaded and ready to fire, so all the soldier has to do is cock and fire without having to put a cap on. This prevents the hammer from actually contacting the percussion cap. So the hammer can get knocked and banged, and there's no risk at all of setting the cap off. This was not unique to Danish rifles. There were other contemporary European powers used kind of the same system. Let's see. The sights, these are sometimes called Austrian sights. The Danes even called them the grasshopper sight, which is interesting. And the base sight is set at 300 Allen. And Allen is an old Austrian measure. I'm grateful to my friend Thomas, who has guided me through some of these old Danish measures. But an Allen is 2 Danish feet, and it's about 63 meters or like 69-ish yards. So in 1862, there was a Danish manual that is explaining with this 300 Allen sight, the soldier needs to know that if you're firing at enemies that are closer than that, you have to aim low. You have to aim several feet low. So aim at the feet or at the knees at these short distances. I didn't know that when I took this to the range, and that's why I was shooting right over the top of the target. But the sight there's a screw here. Hopefully I'm not blocking everything. This just loosens up, and this slides. It goes all the way up to 800 Allen. And this apparently resembles a grasshopper, or maybe more like a, I don't know, but it's called the grasshopper sight, up to a kind of optimistic 800 Allen, which is about 500 meters. But this rifle could do it, especially at a formation-sized group of soldiers. It's within the power of this rifle to put rounds on a formation size. The ammunition, it's a very simple bullet. The bullet has a thin waist in it, which I think is meant to be a weak point so that the lead can collapse down as the soldier is ramming it. And they used a very simple paper cartridge, pinched and folded in the common continental way, and that just got dipped in grease. There's no powder cylinder in these cartridges. And when the Danes adopted this model in 1848, they probably did not know that in France there were several brilliant French officers at the school at Visson that were developing a new generation of infantry small arms. So you've got Touvenon is there, Tamige is there, and a guy called Claude-Etienne Minié, who you probably heard of. And of course, they introduced the new system where the bullet simply has a hollow base, and the explosion of the gas at the breech expands the bullet, removes the requirement for the soldier to smack the bullet down several times to expand it. And the Minie system it's simpler and better, and it is almost instantly widely adopted. There was a period of transition. The powers of Europe didn't give up their carabine à tige rifles overnight, but there's no pillar in the breech, so the gun, just at a practical measure, is a lot easier to clean now. You don't have this piece of metal sticking out of the breech. You just gently ram the bullet down so it's resting on top of the powder. You don't have to smack it down, and there's no change in how the gun fires based on how hard or how soft you ram a bullet down onto a pillar. So that's why I say that this is a rifle that went from the cutting edge of military firearm design to obsolete in a year, because that's 1849 is when Minié introduced his new system. And in the mid 1850s, the pillar-breech rifles were on their way out, and the Minié system is being adopted everywhere. Um, and some countries adopted the Minié rifle and kept their older TJ rifles because they just couldn't get the Minié rifles fast enough. Denmark was one of those countries. They took old muskets and rifled them out. You can do that with the Minié system. And they were introducing French designs of Minié rifles as well. But for the most part, the French infantry remained armed with a smoothbore into the 1850s and 1860s. And Denmark, of course, it's not a very large country. They had a small army and a correspondingly small military budget. So you tend to make do with what you have longer. And the 1848 rifle, it is a good rifle. For what it is, it might be inferior to the Minié system, but it's competitive enough that it's not worthless. And in the Second Schleswig War in 1864, the Model 1848 rifle was probably one of, if not the best infantry rifle that the Danish army had. And of course, it was outclassed by the Prussian Dreise needle rifle. And the Austrians also were involved in the Schleswig War. They had the Lorenz, which was also a superior, more advanced rifle. But most of these, after the Schleswig War, ended up being converted into breechloaders. And it's kind of unusual, and off the top of my head, I can't think of another pillar-breech rifle that was converted into being a breechloader. It's not common to take a pillar-breech rifle and turn it into a breechloader, let's just say that. But again, Denmark, small country, limited budget, they're using what they have. So the ones that are encountered today in Europe, almost all of them have been converted, except for the ones, again, this is my theory, that the Prussians were able to capture and haul back as trophies. So it is very rare in Europe, and especially rare here in the United States, to find them in their original muzzle-loading tap rifle configuration. And that's my best guess as to how this one ended up in the States. It would have been a American GI bringback at some point during the 20th century. But that is the Danish Model 1848 tap rifle, a rifle that went from being the cutting edge, the latest, most advanced military rifle design to being obsolete in about a year, at least in theory. In practice, it hung on a little bit longer. But I'm Brett from papercartridges.com. If this was interesting to you, I would really appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe, especially if you enjoy this kind of hyper nerdy gun history context sort of videos. But yeah, like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time. Se der forvælger slot, som tapper han soldat. Hurra!